Chapter 21. Parisian Pals. "I killed him in self-defense," she said quietly. "He was going to kill all of us." Indy stared at the body sprawled across the mound. "Why would he want to kill you?" "Plenty of reasons. Jealousy, mainly. Panos told him about us, but he was angry that the king got away and he blamed me." He watched her closely. There was no sign of any trance-induced aberrations in her features. She was calm and actually looked relieved after killing her long-standing lover. The gun dangled loosely in her hand. He hoped she was going to drop it, because he was going to pounce on it when she did. His eyes slid to Shannon and Conrad, who were standing to one side of him. They were as nervous now as when he'd arrived. Dorian sensed their unease. "Don't look at me like I'm some kind of madwoman. You're all alive because of me." "What are you going to do now?" Conrad asked, taking a step closer to her. She smiled amiably. "I know exactly what I'm going to do, and you three are going to help me." Conrad moved another pace closer and held out his hand. "That's good, Dorian. I'll take the gun. You don't need it anymore." Her body tensed and she pointed the revolver at Conrad. "Don't patronize me, Professor. I know what I'm doing. Sit down, all three of you. I'm going to give you a little history lesson about Delphi. You like history, don't you, Professor?" She grinned at him, and for an instant Indy recognized the expression he'd seen on her face when she was Pythia. He wondered about that, and sat down with the others as she'd ordered. "In ancient times, Delphi was like a magnet that drew people from around the Mediterranean," she began. This was madness. Three bodies were lying behind her, and she was lecturing as if she were in class at the Sorbonne. Indy was tempted to tell her to shut up, but he was certain she could shoot him with as much ease as she had killed Mandrake. It was not only the mephitic gases that were involved in Pythia's power, but also the omphalos, a mysterious black cone-shaped stone. Dorian looked over her audience. "It's down there in the crevice within our reach. Indy found it, and I want it." "How are we going to get it?" Shannon asked, playing the role of an interested student. "You and the professor are going to lower your friend on a rope. He's going to get a chance to improve his archaeological skills and recover one of the most valuable artifacts of all time." She turned to Indy. "Do you agree to do it?" As if he had a choice, he thought. "I don't see any rope." "You're going to get it. Go to the workshop. You'll find a rope and my excavating tools on the table. And hurry." Then her voice toughened. "But if you're not back in 15 minutes, your friends will be joining the others. Do you understand?" "You don't have to threaten me, Dorian." She smiled and her features softened. "I like you, Indy. I'm sorry I have to do it this way, but I have no choice. Without the gun, I couldn't count on your cooperation." Indy quickly descended the mound, passing the bodies of Panos, Grigoris, and Mandrake. He rushed across the ruins to the wooded trail that led to the workshop. He had to tell someone what had happened, but he didn't have time to go to the village or anywhere else. As it was, he had to hurry in order to retrieve the equipment and get back in time. He found the same rope that had been used to pull him from the hole neatly coiled on the table. Next to it was Dorian's knapsack and her excavating tools. From the way they were laid out, he wondered if she had planned the whole thing. If that were the case, she must also have planned to kill Mandrake. The woman was truly the Ice Queen after all, a cold-blooded, cold-hearted killer. He glanced around the workshop. Everything else looked the same as when he'd last seen it. He walked over to Dorian's locker and found the schedule of risings still taped to the back wall. The next one was due at 3:49 p.m. There should be plenty of time to get the omphalos, or whatever it was, out of the hole, but the vapors were more of an annoyance than anything else to Indy. He'd breathed the so-called mephitic gases a couple of times now and had never experienced anything unusual. It was like walking in fog, nothing more. The king had wanted to believe so badly in their healing properties that the pain in his hip probably did subside for a while. Indy would be surprised if the pain wasn't back. So why was Dorian's reaction to the vapor so dramatically different from his own and everyone else's? What made her Pythia, but not anyone else? He was about to close the locker door when he spotted something familiar on the top shelf. He reached up and grabbed his whip. Maybe she considered it a memento from another graduate student lover, but this graduate student had a big advantage. He knew about the others, and of their demise. He hitched the whip on his belt and he left the workshop. He slung the pack over one shoulder and the rope over the other. He'd taken only a step out the door when he saw two men approaching on horseback. He was in luck. He'd tell them to get help. As they moved closer, though, his hope faded as rapidly as light at the end of the day. Soldiers. He lowered his head, pulled his hat down low, and walked quickly away. But just as he reached the beginning of the trail to the ruins, one of the men called out to him, "You there! Have you seen Colonel Mandrake?" He shook his head and kept walking. "Let's check the ruins," the soldier said, and Indy recognized his voice. The same bastard who had jumped him outside the cave. "Hey, wait a minute. Isn't that the guy we were guarding?" the other said. Indy kept moving, hoping the soldiers would start another argument. As the trail curved and he moved out of sight, he broke into a run. But he'd gone only a dozen yards before he heard the thunder of horses behind him. He leapt off the trail, dropped the rope and knapsack, and unhitched his whip. As the first rider neared him, he snapped it with a swift, smooth swing. The whip uncoiled in an elliptical arc and snared the soldier by the neck. With a quick jerk, he yanked him to the ground. The second horse reared to avoid the soldier in its path and threw its rider. Indy snatched up a rifle that had fallen at his feet and aimed it at the soldiers. "On your feet! Get against that tree!" They did as he said, but as he leaned over to pick up the coil of rope, one of the men lunged at him. Indy swung the butt of the rifle around and cracked it against the side of his head. The soldier took two stuttering steps, tottered, then dropped to his knees and fell over. The other soldier, meanwhile, slipped a hand into his boot and pulled a knife. With a smooth motion, he hurled it from ankle level. Indy ducked, and the knife stuck into the trunk of a tree barely an inch from his head. He glanced at the blade, then back at the soldier. The man stared at him, uncertain what to do. Then, deciding that retreat was the best idea, he turned and ran. But Indy was ready for him. He'd gone only a couple of steps before the whip unfurled and caught him around the ankles. He reeled him in like a fish, but his catch turned on him. He leapt up, threw a punch that glanced off Indy's shoulder. Indy landed one of his own solidly against the man's jaw. The soldier fell backwards, struck his head against a tree trunk, and was out cold. Indy found a length of rope in the saddlebag of one of the horses. He tied the rope around the chest of one of the soldiers, looped it over a thick branch, and pulled the man to his feet as he tied the other end around his partner. When he was finished, both men were seated back to back and held up by the rope and branch. "I'd stick around and chat, fellows, but I'm short on time." With that, he hooked his whip back on his belt, grabbed the knapsack, rope, and rifle, and mounted one of the horses. But he was loaded down with too much gear, and tumbled out of the saddle. He glared at the groggy soldiers as he dusted himself off. "Don't say a word." This time he slipped the rope and knapsack in a saddlebag. He mounted the horse again and galloped off. Not much time left, and he didn't want to test Dorian. But now things were going to be different. He was armed, and all he had to do was catch her off guard. He reined in the horse as he reached the outskirts of the ruins. The fog had lifted, but the columns of the temple obscured the view of the mound, and he couldn't see any of them. He dismounted, grabbed the gear, and walked as fast as he could towards the temple, holding the rifle parallel with his legs. As the mound came into view, he stopped short. No one was on it or anywhere nearby. The temple looked empty, and the bodies were gone. What the hell? He wasn't sure what to do. Check the hut. He hurried over to it and stopped outside the door. On the far side of it were two horses. He heard voices coming from inside. You think these bone diggers do it here on the floor, Brent? Hmm, probably with the bones. I don't believe it, Indy muttered. He threw open the cloth door. What are you two doing here? Indy! Hiya, kiddo! Madeline was wearing riding pants, high boots, and a felt hat with a pheasant feather. Jonesy, look at you! Brent stepped out of the hut after her and stroked his thin mustache. All decked out for archaeology. Rope, knapsack, even a rifle. And dirty, too. Real authentic. Can you keep it down? Andy glanced towards the mound, but nothing had changed. No one was in sight. We're leaving for Athens this morning and decided to ride out and say goodbye, Madeline said in her squeaky voice. The king's left, you know, so it's getting boring. Boring is not the word for it, Brent chimed in, adjusting the kerchief he wore with his safari outfit. Listen, did you see anyone else in here? Not a soul, Madeline said. Didn't think we'd see you either. So what exciting things have you been doing? Haven't seen you much since the royal reception. Nothing much, Indy said dryly. Where's Shannon? Haven't seen him since we got here. He's around. He had to do something. He needed them to get help, but they'd probably fetch soldiers, and he doubted he could trust any of them. He jammed a hand in his jacket pocket and felt a head of garlic, and suddenly an idea occurred to him. Listen, are you going back to the village before you leave? We're not riding horses to Athens, Brent said. You can be sure of that. Would you mind doing me a favor? I suppose, Madeline said, if it doesn't take too long and if Brent doesn't mind. Go to the hotel for me and tell Nikos, the kid at the desk, that I'm going down into the crevice again and need my moly. Your what? She said. He knows what it is. Of course. Moly. It's an archaeology thing, Brent said knowingly. One of those digging tools or something. For boring holes, I think. I'm right, aren't I, Jonesy? That's it. Please hurry. I need it real fast. Do you want us to bring it back to you? Madeline asked. No, Nikos can handle it. I've got to go. Have a good trip. See you in Paris, Indy. She kissed him on the cheek, then hooked her arm in Brent's as they walked out of the hut and over to their horses. Indy picked up the rifle and peered towards the mound. Dorian must have seen Madeline and Brent and decided to hide. He moved away from the hut, crossed the sacred way, and stopped at one of the pillars. He set the rifle against it and stepped out into view. Dorian, where are you? Right behind you. Indy jumped at the sound of her voice. When he turned, she was standing by the pillar, one hand aiming a revolver at him, the other gripping the rifle. Surprise. She must have been watching from the other side of the pillar, but he guessed she was too far away to have heard their conversation. What did you tell your friends? That I was busy and wished them a good trip to Athens. She looked towards the road. Why are they heading back to the village? To get their bags in a carriage, I suppose. They just rode out to say goodbye. She nodded and watched him closely. You are on my side, aren't you? Indy looked at the rifle, then gave Dorian the most sincere look he could manage. Of course I am. I'd be dead if you hadn't saved us. If your charming friends bring back soldiers, we're all in trouble, you know. They won't. And you don't have to point that gun at me either. She jabbed the rifle lightly in his side. I'm not a fool, Indy. Where did you get this rifle? He told her about his encounter with the soldiers. If I hadn't stopped them, they would be here now looking for Mandrake. Well, they wouldn't find him here. He didn't know what she meant. Where are Shannon and Conrad? He asked as they headed towards the mound. Jack and Ted? She glanced towards the crevice. Let's go find them. So they were Jack and Ted now. This better not be a sick joke, he thought. If they were dead, he didn't know what he would do, but it wouldn't be nice. Where are the bodies? Gone, she said blithely. Gone, he thought. like Richard Farnsworth and who knows how many other old boyfriends. He waited for her to explain as they climbed the mound. Did you see Alex anywhere out there? She asked as she reached the top of the mound. What? Alex. Did you see him? She was mad, all right. Dorian, remember, you killed Alex. No, I didn't. She smiled, then turned towards the crevice. It's okay, fellows. Everyone's gone and Indy's back. Oh, Jesus. His stomach knotted. She must have shot them and dumped their bodies in the hole. She was denying everything, even that she'd killed Mandrake. It must be the vapors. Somehow they had affected her mind, and he couldn't stop himself from telling her exactly what he was thinking. What did the vapors do to you, Dorian? I don't understand. She looked into his eyes and laughed. You mean when I was Pythia? You don't know, do you, Indy? You don't know what I felt in the vapors. No, I don't. She took a step closer to him. Careful. Watch her closely, Indy thought. I felt the same as you, she said. Indy frowned, shook his head. What do you mean? I don't understand. There was no trance, she said curtly. I was faking all of it. How could you? I mean, you were babbling and Panos was interpreting it. She shook her head. Panos wanted to believe so badly that he thought he was interpreting, but he was just following cues I had given him. I told him that the king was in danger the day before I faked the trance. He knew that was what Pythia was supposed to tell him. God, she was even more devious than he'd given her credit for. Where are they, Dorian? He spoke tersely. He wanted to grab her by the shoulders and shake her. Where is Jack? Where is Ted? She motioned Indy to walk around to the other side of the crevice. Over there. He moved away from her, sidling around the crevice to avoid turning his back on her. The mound on the other side was more like a pinnacle, narrow on top with steep sides, the crevice on one side, the gully on the other. Indy peered over the far edge and for a second didn't see anything. Then he spotted the pair 20 feet below, squatting backs against the dirt wall. Are you guys okay? Just fine, Shannon said. Pull them out with the rope, Dorian ordered. And hurry. We've got work to do. He started to say he'd use his whip, but caught himself. So far, she hadn't paid it any heed, and he was better keeping it that way. He pulled Shannon out first as Conrad pushed from below. You had me worried, Jack, he said as he grabbed him by the arm. Why didn't you answer? He tossed the line back down, and Conrad quickly scaled the side of the gully. She knew where we were, Shannon said offhandedly. She made us dump the bodies in the hole, then jump in here. Only 2 of the bodies, Conrad said, brushing off his hands. Mandrake's still alive. She let him go. What? I told you I didn't kill him, Dorian called from across the crevice. When I saw him stand up so bravely and hobble away, I couldn't do it. I let him go. You know what else? Shannon said. There was no blood where he'd been lying. Figure that out. Indy couldn't, but he had an ominous feeling that they hadn't seen the last of Colonel Mandrake. It's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.